find her.
Well, the only problem with closing everybody's mic before you do, can they open them one at a time?
Oh, they can after. Yes.
Okay, because one of the things that if everyone's really good about it, we can have the feedback, but I guess it's better to close them. I don't know. It's just that sometimes people have a comment to make that's very useful for the talk.
Oh, they can either put their hand up. I'm completely
Okay.
okay with that, or they can just.
Here, and I will start right away answering Jack's question to the best of my ability. The picture that you are looking at on the screen under the Aires Lake Champlain is I believe it was a postcard originally of the summit of Mont Tremblant. And I was going to ask Sheila Wheeler if she recognizes it, because it probably would have been associated with gray rocks in the first decade of the 1900s. It's probably taken from a bluff or someone climbed a tree. It certainly wasn't a plane. It was too early. In any case, it's too overcast. So Sheila, do you have any recollection or have you seen this picture before?
Sheila's still muted.
Oh.
Mute. There, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
I have not seen this picture before, but the two gentlemen in the picture remind me of Mr. Wheeler Sr. I don't know why. It's just the way that he's pointing and standing and his shorts. I guess you do not know who the two men are. And I don't know. And I don't recognize exactly where I came into the Wheeler family in 1969. Obviously, we have no date on this picture, do we?
No, there is no date. Well, thanks very much. I suspected also it was the senior Mr. Wheeler, but anyway, there you go. It's an interesting picture, and the reason I showed it is not because the air on the summit of Mont Tremblant is like Champagne, but that Mont Tremblant figures into this story. And but the story starts, so there was two influences that got this going aside from the railroad and so on. One was Sir John William Dawson, who was the principal of McGill University and also a geologist, who came up to St. Agathe on one of the very early trains. The first train to St. Agathe would have come up in 1892. It's likely it didn't go further at that time. What he did afterwards is he wrote an article for Harper's magazine in the United States, marveling about St. Agathe, about the geology, about the air, about all kinds of aspects of it. But the expression is not his. We'll go on, sorry about that. Okay. We'll go on to see where that comes from. I have to, okay, there we go. This is a picture of Elizabeth Wand, we imagine, sitting in her living room in her health convalescent home in St. Agathe, which she called Kisisana. Here is health. And she was actually the one who first used that expression. And I want to read you something to show it. But in the meantime, I'll show you her first location, which she built herself. It's absolutely a beautiful building, and it's still there, and we'll get back to that in a second. But let me read something from her book. In around 1930, she wrote a book called Kisisana. She was no longer in St. Agathe. She left probably at 1902 or somewhere around there. I found St. Agathe a village nestled at the lower end of the lake. The houses mostly built of logs with plaster between and whitewashed. Little gardens with vegetables and flowers, all so neat and trim looking. The people clad in homespun of their own weaving, knitted stockings, good thick ones, also the work of the women and girls. The Catalogne carpets and braided rugs, such a happy looking industrious people, hospitable and kindly to a degree. One of these log houses was decorated on the outside with a shining dishpan and black frying pan hung out to air. The old lady and her husband lived alone. They were amongst the first settlers in this new country. Her house was immaculate inside and out, and where her dishpan and frying pan hung, there was never a mark on the whitewashed wall. With her gray homespun dress, her frilled white cap, and wooden shoes, which she wore in the garden, she was an ornament to the village. Her house was known to all newcomers as the frying pan house, and many and sweet the bunches of flowers she picked for me and from her gay little garden. Her house consisted of 2 rooms and an attic. The living room was kitchen and dining room, also bedroom. The 4-poster in the corner with its patchwork quilt, the Cataloging carpet on the floor, and the large box stove shining like a mirror all denoted a good housekeeper. The second room was sacred to the guest, its 4-poster with thick feather bed, knitted bedspread, and braided pillow shams, the valance of white pleated cotton, its rocking chair with a bright cushion, woven carpet, and braided rug by the bedside, gave a welcome to the lucky guest. The house was placed with its end to the street. The length of the house, which had a platform, was on the side facing the garden. After the day's work was done, Darby and Joan were to be seen seated in the rocking chairs, smoking their pipes, which were often upside down. Now, one of the interesting things about Elizabeth Wand is she read Dawson's article in Harper's Magazine, and she was, at the time, she was a nurse in New York City, and she was fascinated and intrigued. And so she came to St. Agathe and decided that this would be an ideal spot to set up a health spa for convalescents. The first thing she did is she undertook to get a piece of land and build herself a house, and went to Montreal and left a business card with many doctors saying, when you have any patients who need convalescence, here is my card. They told her that they probably wouldn't be able to use it, and that she was well ahead of her time. This kind of thing wasn't done yet, and so on. But she pursued and believed that it would work. Now, the picture of the building that you can see here was taken by, is a Notman picture. It's in the McCord Museum, but it was probably taken at the time after she sold it, because she sold the house to Wilson Smith, the mayor of Montreal. And this may have been when he owned it. We have no way of knowing. But today,
Joe,
yeah.
Philippa has a question. She has her hand up.
Okay.
Philippa, if you want to come off Zoom and ask your question. Oh, maybe it was an accident.
Philippa, are you there? So what I could do is continue.
Yeah, continue. Oh, there.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was an accident.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to find my way around so that I can see people, but I don't want to interrupt. It's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry. This is a picture of Elizabeth Wand's house much later. This was in the 1990s. And excuse me, I'm just going to have a sip of water. But you can see the round house, and when she was building it back in the late 1800s, people would stop by and mock her for doing such a thing. But it turned out to be a permanent fixture in St. Agathe. It's on the Tour de Lac. If you drive past the manor house, you'll see it pretty soon. I'm putting these things in terms of most of the people who are participating today. So forgive me if I'm getting it wrong for yourselves, but I guess it's the corner of Hillside, but somewhere right around there. When she sold it, she built herself another house. And this second home was built above that one. It's not there anymore. I have found photos of it from the top of the mountain looking at the lake, but we can't, it doesn't exist. It was taken down at some point. One of the problems that Elizabeth Wand had with this whole project in St. Agathe was that after a very short time, her patients began to get scared away. And this is another part of that article that was posted in Harper's magazine, which she couldn't have foreseen. And also a part of an initiative that was undertaken by a doctor who had gone to the Quebec government with a brilliant idea. But I'll get to him in just a moment. The problem was tuberculosis. People were coming to St. Agathe to take what they call the rest cure. And now the rest cure was that you rested in a dry, cool air. And that's what St. Agathe was. And you did some basic exercises, but mostly it was rest. People literally began to buy properties from the United States in St. Agathe who had a sick child or a sick member of the family, build houses and come up and take the rest cure. You could do it officially at a place like Saranac Lake, but there was also this option. So I was very curious about learning more about tuberculosis and its treatment in St. Agathe, and I found myself that I was going to Ottawa, so I decided to go to the National Archives and do some digging. At that time, it was the 1990s, must have been 94, 95, somewhere in there. Intrawest had taken over Mont Tremblant, and everything was Mont Tremblant. And I was trying to find out what is St. Agathe, because Mont Tremblant seemed to be completely taking up all of the Laurentian oxygen. So I went into the microfiche and I looked through the big lens, and what I found was the Mont Tremblant Sanatorium for tuberculosis, created by Dr. Camille Laviolette. And I thought, what? Even here? I really felt this was a terrible moment of shock for me to realize that St. Agathe couldn't even claim tuberculosis. It was in Mont Tremblant in 1897, according to this image. Well, it turned out that Laviolette was an ear, nose, and throat specialist, not a TB specialist. But he had gone to the Quebec Assembly and proposed to build a tuberculosis sanatorium on the side of Mont Tremblant. And his idea was so intriguing to them that they created, for the protection of the land that he would need, a gigantic parcel of reserve land to keep the air clean. Tuberculosis, if you just to try to get your mind around it for a moment, tuberculosis was the greatest enemy of mankind. Between 1700 and 1900, 1 billion people died of tuberculosis. The world population reached 2 billion in the 1930s. So you can imagine it was worse than cholera, smallpox, all of those things came and went, but tuberculosis was always there. And tuberculosis also had it attacked the people in prime of life, late teens to in their 40s. That's when it was the worst. So it really created problems for the society. Therefore, the government was quite encouraging, and this parcel of land came to be known as Mont Tremblant Park. So you can see I had a right to be a little bit surprised. Continuing my research, though, I found that the real genius behind the rest cure was a German, a Prussian, if you wish, who was a botanist, and he contracted tuberculosis and realized he was going to die. He was in his late teens, early 20s. He had just finished his courses in botany, and he accepted very resignedly that tuberculosis was going to take him. So he decided to give himself a place to die, and he went to the Himalayas, where he could explore the plants and record them and do everything that he loved to do. And over time, he discovered that he was getting better and that he completely cured from tuberculosis. He came back to Germany. His town was actually Prussia encroached in Poland at that time. So this is his town in the Silesian Mountains. And he went back to school, became a doctor, and proposed the concept of what we call the rest cure. The first thing he did is he built some cottages in this location, but Prussia had indemnity insurance. People could literally have a disability insurance policy and have their healthcare needs covered. And so he managed to get a huge number of clients, and ultimately he had a 300-bedroom SAN in this location. His concept spread. It spread to Switzerland. It spread to lots of places. And one of the places it spread to was Saranac Lake. Edward Livingston Trudeau, the family, as far as I understand, were originally from Quebec, were living in New York City. He was a doctor, and he went through pretty much the same thing as Bremer. He contracted tuberculosis. His younger brother had died from it. He decided to go to Saranac Lake and to die there in the mountains. And when he went there, the owner of the hotel recorded how he was so skinny and so wasted away that it was like carrying a paper bag up to his room. There was just nothing there, but he healed. And while he healed, he began to study, and he discovered Bremer, and he realized what he was onto, and he created the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium in 1885. It grew to make Saranac Lake the center of tuberculosis treatment, pretty much in the Northeast anyway, if not all of the United States. Very similar environment to St. Agathe. It just as an aside, his great grandson is Jerry Trudeau, the cartoonist, and his son and grandson both took over the tuberculosis project in Saranac Lake after him. There was another man whose name was Arthur Joseph Richer, who was a doctor specializing in tuberculosis cure. It's hard to find a lot of information about him, but I have found some. He spent time in Europe where he learned about the rest cure and was determined that we should have it in St. Agathe, in Canada at any rate. And he came back and he came to St. Agathe. And for some strange reason, no one ever told him about this land reserved at the side of Mont Tremblant. So he built a SAN in St. Agathe, and it opened in 1899. 200 doctors came up for the opening. So you can see just how much importance this was given. The SAN was built on the hill. If you imagine yourself driving up the Laurentian autoroute, you just passed Trout Lake, and suddenly there's a vista looking north. You can probably see all the way to Mont Tremblant. The view is spectacular. That's where he built his SAN. It was a beautiful location. And it was a great success at first. It burnt to the ground in 1902. In 1902, after it burnt to the ground, St. Agathe was absolutely terrified by tuberculosis and how contagious it was, and passed a law saying that you could not build a sanatorium in St. Agathe. So Richer, not to be put off, created what he called Bremer's Rest. And Bremer's Rest, Bremer connected to tuberculosis, of course, was for people who might look like they could have tuberculosis in the future if they didn't have a rest. And he managed to get a clientele for that. And Bremer's Rest, according to this picture, which was taken, I found it in the 1912 history of St. Agathe, and it said that it was a few miles out of the village on the river. I have never found that building, but sometime later he moved his SAN into St. Agathe, and it was at the corner of St. Vincent. St. Vincent and St. Antoine, roughly. Today it's an evangelical church, still there. Something else was going on though in St. Agathe, and that was the Allen family. Now, the Allen family were
It froze up here.
Yeah, that happens sometimes, unfortunately, with the internet connections. Joe, you froze for a second. Oh, I can't hear you. Joe? I can't hear you.
Told them since Mr. Allen Sr., John Alexander Allen, had tuberculosis, he said, well, go to St. Agathe and you can cure from tuberculosis there. Other people are doing it. So they came to St. Agathe, and I, through great good fortune, got Kit Playfair's written summary of that from her memory. She's the granddaughter of the Allens. And she said that they opened up a SAN in 1899 in St. Agathe, and it's possible that it was the very first one. We don't know. Proper research has not been done. The building that you see here, where her SAN was located, you see two images of it. One is a stone house. It's on St. Antoine, 11 St. Antoine, and today it is the private home of Michel Joannet. His father, Albert Joannet, was a doctor specializing in tuberculosis. But the building below is an older picture, and there you can see one of the key signatures of tuberculosis cure, the rest porches, places where you could go outside, sit in a dry place, wrapped in furs, in the cold winter air, and slowly rest. And that was a very good way of taking on the challenge of tuberculosis. According to Kit Playfair, they kept the property going as a SAN until 1911. Now, the curious thing to me was I did a title search on this property to confirm its location, to confirm the Allen's presence. And I also talked to Michel Joannet, who I've talked with many times over the years. He has a lot of historical information. He's one of those valuable ignored assets of St. Agathe. He can't join us today because he doesn't have any kind of way of getting on the computer. He's quite elderly himself, and I tried to encourage him to get help, and he declined. But in any case, he told me that he knew Kit Playfair, and she had shown him a picture of her grandfather on the porch of this house. So there's no question that they were there, according to him. And it turns out that the title shows that the Charbonneau family built the home, but it's very possible that they rented it for those years when it was the SAN. The other thing that's unusual about this particular one is that it was open during the period when tuberculosis treatment was illegal in St. Agathe. And it's possible that they couldn't stop it. It had an acquired right, which would make it still more probable that it was before 1900. But this is going to take some fascinating research, because it would make it one of the first SANs in Canada. And it's a forgotten piece of history. The first SAN in Canada was in I'll get there in a second. Just one other thing I wanted to share about, which is I find really fascinating about the Allen family. In let's see, they were there for 11 years. So it'll be about 1910, somewhere around there. They closed the SAN. He was better. They went back to their life in Montreal, and they still wanted to stay in St. Agathe. They found an island in Lac des Sables that everyone called Blueberry Island, or at least they did. And they discovered that the owner of it, Vincent Bonelli, was from Vicksburg, Mississippi. And he had bought that island, built a lovely house on it, and stayed there until one of the family members overcame tuberculosis, and then basically left, abandoned it, went back to the States. They found the Bonelli family, and they bought the island, and the family still owns it today. They never had they put electricity in, I think, in the late 1990s, maybe after the turn of the century. So they kept it authentic for a very, very long time. But in any case, the very first SAN was the Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium in Gravenhurst. And it was started by William James Gage, who was a school teacher who saw the need for this kind of treatment and worked very hard to make it happen. And he was knighted clearly for his incredible efforts, because among them was a free tuberculosis hospital. At one point, he realized that people thought that if you were going to a SAN, it's because you were very wealthy. He said, no, this whole image has to change. People have to understand that anyone can go. And most of the SANs would not refuse people. It wasn't a question of money. It was a question of helping people overcome tuberculosis. But not always. D. Lorne McGibbon had a country home in St. Agathe, and this is his country home. Now, I argue that McGibbon was one of the Laurentians' greatest benefactors. He was the man who headed the Canada Rubber Company. He was very wealthy. He was very generous. He was loved in St. Agathe. He started a hotel. This was his private home, which is much, much bigger than the hotel he started. And he actually was the very first person to get professional skiing into the Laurentians. He brought Emile Cauchon from Switzerland and paid for him to teach skiing in St. Agathe. Now, if you have been watching the Chloe's shows, Michelle Sullivan did a story on that included the Cauchons. I think it was the last one or a set 2 ago. I'm not sure, but it was very good. So you can see that on YouTube, and you can learn more about the Cauchons there. Lorne McGibbon contracted tuberculosis, and his doctor sent him to Saranac Lake. And when he was in Saranac Lake, he had to leave things like his hotel under management. Cauchon would not have been there yet. Cauchon came around 1909. This would have been before that. But when he was there, he met a doctor, and that doctor's name was J. Roddick Byers. And he was there because he had tuberculosis too. And he was also from Canada. He was from Sherbrooke. And he, in his own words, said that he exhausted himself delivering as many as 4 children a day, 4 babies a day, and just collapsed through exhaustion and went for the rest cure. McGibbon said to Byers, we should have one of these in Canada. We should have one near us, say in St. Agathe. He already had a place in St. Agathe. He said, when you're going to be out before I am, go to St. Agathe. There's a property I want you to buy it. And when I come out, we'll build the SAN together. And you get everything worked out in the meantime. So off he went. Byers arrived in St. Agathe and bought the land, 50 acres above the village, and then discovered that he couldn't do it because the town had a law saying you cannot put a SAN up in St. Agathe. He decided to break the bad news to McGibbon, and just the whole thing would be over. And McGibbon said, no way, I'm going to come up, set up a meeting for me with the municipal council. McGibbon came up, talked with the municipal council, told them about the virtues of tuberculosis cure, described Saranac Lake to them, and then at the end of it said, I want you to reconsider that law. I want you to take a vote on it, but not before you spend a week at Saranac Lake on at my expense. You can go there whenever whenever you're ready, you go there and you'll see. Well, they did, and they changed the law. Byers oversaw the construction of the hospital. They started in 1908, and that's why I say it was before Cauchon. The building was opened in 1912. It was finished in 1911. It's the building behind the current hospital. It was the administration. Now I think it's used for other offices. It's a beautiful building. It was designed by architects from Saranac Lake, and similar to properties that you would see there if you visited. Just as to get a sense of the SAN and its period of time, the period of time it covered. It was open in 1908, and it was open until 1968. And you can see the 3 medical directors there. It had only 3 rather in that long period of time, largely because of Dr. Learn Phillips, who was there for 35 years. Looking at the math, he was a very, very popular, basically, leader in our community. Can Chloe, can other people see those green lines over the picture?
I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, I don't either. Anyway, I guess we just have to live with it. Sorry, folks.
I think it's happened to me on a couple of presentations too. That Chloe, I think if you're the host, you can erase it. Somebody was experimenting around and wound up drawing them.
Okay, I'm gonna try something.
Yeah, there.
Clear.
Oh, well done.
Thank
don't
you
know
very
that.
much.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Norman.
Okay.
So, but the sand in St. Agatha was not the only sand. As a matter of fact, Phelps himself came to St. Agatha for the TB treatment. And then when he graduated as a doctor, he went to work at a different sand in St. Agatha before he went to the Laurentian sand. And there's a story there. Calixte Laframboise's farm in St. Agatha South was sold to a group of what we would call today communists. These were Eastern European immigrants who believed they could create a real commune. And they went with the idea and bought the property from Laframboise. Now, Calixte Laframboise must have wondered, because he was having trouble supporting his family on this farm, and they were planning to support many families. They went to the Baron de Hirsch Institute and they got funding to do this. And the funding was given through to these immigrant people in the Jewish community, interest-free, for them to reestablish themselves. So you can see there's a whole judgment that was done, because the first person, two of the partners sold out to the rest, and the rest couldn't keep it going. And they, one after the other, they drifted back to Montreal. And it turned out that the person who actually had put the money up was Sir Mortimer Davis. So I'll just give you some background. First of all, this is his house in St. Agatha. He was 2 doors away from Lord McGibbon. And the reason that he was there was that he was invited by Lord Shaughnessy, a friend of his, to Shaughnessy's private club in Montreal. And when they got to the door, Davis was refused. No Jews allowed. Shaughnessy was absolutely shocked, insisted that Davis come and visit him in the country. And Shaughnessy had a house. I don't have a picture of it here, but it's a blue A structure kind of house, quite large, that is between the 2 stone houses, McGibbon's and Davis's. And Lord Shaughnessy convinced Davis to buy the farm next door, which he did, and he built this house. Now, I have an interesting connection to this house, because the painting that you see was done by my grandmother. Now, as an artist, she was taking her time, and as a result, all the flowers are in bloom, and the leaves have already changed, and she caught all the colors. I thought it was wonderful. I also have another connection, and this is a more significant connection because it's from Sheila's side, and Sheila's great-grandfather actually came up to St. Agatha to meet Davis. I just want to show you what happened when first of all, Davis was contacted by a lawyer named Jacobs, and discovered that his money had to be salvaged in this sand. I don't think that he cared about his money. He had inherited his family's store called the Davis Tobacco Store, and he had turned it into the Imperial Tobacco Company of Canada. He was very, very wealthy, but it was a question of principle. They took the property back, and the Baron de Hirsch Institute turned it over to a doctor who banged a sign in the ground saying Mount Sinai Hospital, because he had backers from the Baron de Hirsch Institute to look after people with tuberculosis. When Davis and Jacobs saw this, they did a fundraising, and they created the Mount Sinai Hospital in 1911. The first doctor was Dr. R.C. Patterson. Now, Patterson, we know, when I was talking with Mount Sinai Hospital, which still exists, there was sorry, the comments light was flashing. There's nothing that I need to know about there. Eh? No, okay. Patterson had to do with St. Agathe even before this time. He was somebody who came up with the YMCA's, there as I can tell by the records, and that's thanks to somebody else who might be with us today, who was looking for information for the Y and came across his name. But in any case, he became the doctor for the San. And when I contacted the Mount Sinai Hospital, they told me most of the records for that time had been destroyed, and they could not give me the name of the doctor. I found it in Dr. Grignot's 50th anniversary history of St. Agathe, Dr. R.C. Patterson. And I also found it in the Baron de Hirsch records, naming him. So I know I could connect the two. When Schilla's great-grandfather came up to St. Agathe, one of the things that he wanted to do was meet with Mortimer Davis to try to get him to help with a project in Montreal, an educational project. His name was Hirsch Wolofsky, and Hirsch Wolofsky was the founder of the Canada Adler, which was a very important, the most important Yiddish publication in Canada, but certainly very, very important in Montreal. And he was a very active community builder. And on the way, when he got to the station, lo and behold, there was Davis headed to Montreal. So he told Davis that he wanted to speak with him, and Davis said, well, come back to Montreal with me. We'll travel together in my car. He had a private train car, different times. And on traveling back to Montreal, Wolofsky recorded this in his memoirs. He describes going by the Shawbridge Boys Farm, and he was arguing that the school that he wanted Davis to support was a religious school. And Davis said, no, we're leaving all of that stuff behind. We're all going to become non-religious now. We're leaving that stuff. Davis was from the Western European Jewish world. His family came from England. Wolofsky was from the Yiddish Eastern European world. And the Yiddish Jews came into Montreal in the first decade of the 1900s and became the by far the more important numerically community. But they were from quite different backgrounds as a result. And anyway, as they were passing the Shawbridge Boys Farm, Davis said to Wolofsky, so there you see the Reform School. So how many religious Jews do you think it has? Probably in proportion to the numbers. And so they began talking, and they said, well, let's see, the Protestant schools in Montreal 50% Jewish attendance. So it's very, very probable that Davis was right. And Wolofsky said, no, they have none. He said, if you can demonstrate that you're right about that, you have my support. Wolofsky confirmed it, sent the note, and after that, Davis supported him, and Wolofsky began to, if he hadn't already been doing it, raise money for the Mount Sinai Hospital. So they cooperated a lot. And Davis actually raised 10% of all Jewish donations in his lifetime per year. And he was a very, very important benefactor. When he passed away, it was probably the largest funeral at the time in Montreal. It was enormous. But we have a picture hanging in our living room by an artist named Boivin. And he was an artist who died of tuberculosis. He went to Mount Sinai Hospital and he painted this painting for another patient and gave it to Wolofsky as a thank you for his help with the hospital. I'll just give you a little bit of a background. Here I found the three homes of three of the doctors we talked about, and I thought it was interesting for you to see them. On the top left is Dr. Byers' house on Rue Albert. Beside it is Dr. Richet's house on Préfontaine. And below is Dr. Patterson's house, not yet found. I'd love to find it. Now, Dr. Byers' house was taken in the 1990s. The Richet house was photographed in the 1950s. And some friends who own the house today, Louise Liboiron said one day she had this group of people who wanted to see the house. And they said, yes, this was given to their grandparents by their grandparents' uncle when in his will. And so they moved to St. Agathe and they lived there for a long time. And the uncle was Dr. Arthur Richet, who died surprisingly young. So anyway, I was delighted to find this connection because there's so much to learn about the history in St. Agathe. It's just it's a wealth. It's not just in St. Agathe, right across the Laurentians, but it'll take lifetimes of people diligently looking to find it all. One of those people, though, that really helps us was Dr. Grignot. This is from his book. He's in the middle, Dr. Edmond Grignot. The Grignot family were all doctors out of St. Jerome. They were an amazing family with doctors, St. Jerome, St. Adele, St. Agathe, and St. Jovite. And I think in Mont-Laurier, one of the siblings was a veterinarian. But in this picture, you can see Patterson's picture on the left, and Byers and Richet's pictures on the right of Dr. Grignot. Those three doctors were all involved in tuberculosis. I won't get into the rest of the people there because that's not part of the topic today. But this is from 1912 again, from Grignot's history, which is we're so lucky to have that. It was done for the 50th anniversary of St. Agathe, and it's a very, very valuable record. One of the things that we found in our research on tuberculosis was rather astounding because Sheila and I went off to Saranac Lake. We were so intrigued by it to find out what we could find about tuberculosis treatment there. And when we got there, we were received like they had been waiting for us. They had set up a whole walking tour of the tuberculosis treatment in Saranac Lake. They were fighting the same battles as we were fighting in St. Agathe for the railroad station conservation. All kinds of things were very, very similar. But one of the things they gave us was a little walking tour that would allow us to walk around Saranac Lake and see all the cure porches that people had built for people in the last stages of tuberculosis, to spend them in private homes where they would be basically tenants. They would sit out on the porches all day. Now, these porches were not built to be heated. They were built to stay cold. You know, a nice cold protected place, especially in the winter. And most of these, you can see that this is St. Vincent Street and places like that. This is very, very prominent in St. Agathe. So it underscores, again, just how important the tuberculosis treatment was in St. Agathe. But what really underscores it is this next picture here. This was the Mount Sinai sanatorium as it would have looked as late as the 1950s, before the subsequent hospital was built. What happened there to make it so big wasn't just tuberculosis. One day, Dr. Byers went to Ottawa when he first set it up. It was 1914, the war was starting, and he wanted to tell the army that they would have a lot of tuberculosis patients, and there was a facility in St. Agathe to look after them. The officer that he met went through their records and said, look, we have 2 cases of tuberculosis in the whole armed forces. We can't really see that this is an issue in any way. So Byers thanked him and went back to St. Agathe. And sometime later, the same year, he got a phone call. Dr. Byers, you are now an officer with the Canadian Forces, and we're sending you the first gas victims. So the gas victims began to pour into St. Agathe along with tuberculosis patients. And a lot of these buildings were built to support them. Even the Laurentide Inn that I showed you in an earlier picture became part of the hospital, looking after soldiers coming back from the war. And that's one of the reasons that Emile Cochon could not stay in St. Agathe, because the hotel that he was living in and working from was taken over by the war, as was everything. But you can see the scale of tuberculosis treatment just by looking at the village and looking at the size of the service behind it. One of the things I found really fascinating about this was that in, I guess, late 1990s, maybe early 2000, a study was done, a history of St. Agathe. And in the study, the historian from St. Jerome said that the largest employer in St. Agathe was Bell Canada. And I thought he missed, in St. Agathe's history, I thought he missed the hospitals. I mean, there were several hospitals. In fact, this next slide shows us one of them. And you might recognize, yeah.
Could you go back to that last one? Was that, you said two things. Is this Mount Sinai in Prefontaine?
No, this is the Laurentian Sand in St. Agathe.
Oh, the Laurentian Sand in St. Agathe. Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
And if you look, can you see
yeah, I can see your cursor, yeah.
Yeah, this is the original building that we saw in the other picture. These buildings, Byers called them chicken coops. He was not going to have chicken coops, but that's what he got. Places that were built quickly to accommodate the soldiers and other TB patients.
But you said earlier that Mount Sinai still exists.
Mount Sinai still exists as a hospital in Montreal. The building
in
is
Montreal.
gone.
Okay, because I saw that. I saw the derelict building in Prefontaine. All right, thank you very much.
Yeah, unfortunately, even it's gone. But Mount Sinai Hospital still exists.
Yeah,
and
sure.
There's a little bit more history that might explain some of that, which I hope to get to with this slide. Lord McGibbon was a wonderful, sharing man, but he had a tough break, you could call it. In 1925 or 26, his company was challenged. His stocks were dropping. It looked like it was going to collapse, and he knew it was just a temporary thing, and he had to somehow save it. So what he did is he personally guaranteed the company, and it failed. So suddenly, Lord McGibbon was a penniless man in his older years, and he didn't tell anybody. Instead, according to George Lortie, who was the man who told me where Dr. Richet's hospital had been built originally, told me that in 1926, Lord McGibbon had the biggest party in St. Agathe's history on a peninsula on the lake that he owned, and everyone was there. McGibbon was friends of everybody, not just the other country people, city people rather. He was friends of everybody, and everyone was invited. And George Lortie was there as a child. He said there was fireworks, there was music. It was the biggest event he could ever remember. And he was an old man who was deaf when he told me that. So it must have been huge. The next week, all these people who came to McGibbon's party discovered that they were footing the bill. But no one resented it. They were so touched by the man himself. The Oblate brothers bought his home eventually, not right away, but a few years later. And lo and behold, it became a sanatorium for members of the church and for others. And people like, some very important people in St. Agathe's history, Baron Lafreniere came here to die of tuberculosis, healed, went back, finished school, and came back to St. Agathe to live and became one of its most important mayors. One of the Cloutier family married-ins came to St. Agathe the same way. The Ferguson family came for tuberculosis cure. There's a huge, long list. But one person who didn't come for tuberculosis cure, but as a doctor specializing in tuberculosis, was Albert Joannet. Albert Joannet was educated in the States, in Switzerland. He worked at Saranac Lake. He worked at a SAN in Switzerland. He was an expert. He had done special inventions that were used for checking for tuberculosis in people's lungs. when the kids, Greg and Bob, you would remember this, we would have to get our x-ray done for tuberculosis at St. Agath at the school. And it was devices that Joannette himself had invented, and Joannette was probably present. I don't know, but he would have been the person who oversaw it. Now, for those of you who remember, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a Christmas seal. The double-barred cross was the symbol of the tuberculosis fundraising. And it was, in my childhood, I remember it everywhere. People would just plaster it onto envelopes as a sign of their support for the cure for tuberculosis. So anyway, I found that image and wanted to put it there. Dr. Joannette himself was also responsible for the sanatorium Villa Notre-Dame de l'Espérance. He also had two small sands that he owned himself. You can start to see that it was a huge, huge enterprise. And even in this newsletter sent out by the Laurentian Sand, there's an ad for the Devonshire House that I'd never heard of. Don't know where it was. It was also, it says 31 St. Agath Street. So I've just never paid attention to it, but there it is, another one of these. And this came out in a sort of turning point year, because it was the year after both McGibbon and Davis had died. Davis left his fortune to be handled to build a public hospital for the Jewish community, where doctors could be Jewish doctors could intern and so on, and his money was also involved in the Jewish General Hospital eventually, but that's another story for another time. One of the things that happened at Mount Sinai in the meantime was that people would, the women's auxiliary would come out to Mount Sinai. Now, Shalom Stern wrote a book called The White House about the history. It's a book of verse. It's written in Yiddish, translated into English. And he talks about how the women came out and agitated for a better hospital in the process of their coming out. And in the 1930s, it was finally built. And this is the building that most of us would probably remember. The old building is behind it. You can see it. And it became the nurses' quarters. So again, you can see the scale of the treatment. And one of the doctors who worked at this hospital was Norman Bethune. Just a little tidbit of history. Now you can see in 1942, a new building was added to the complex. But there's something else I wanted to read to you. As a matter of fact, there's something else that I didn't read to you, and I should have, but I'll read this to you because it's very descriptive of the 1940s period of tuberculosis treatment. What happened is that tuberculosis, you can see the cure porches on the side. This building is still part of the hospital today, as is the SAN, the public hospital. And I'm going to read a story because at that time there was stories about a cure for tuberculosis, antibiotic cure. And I want to read you something that it was in the archives of the SAN about a story told about a 28-year-old nurse. She was admitted to the sanatorium in 1946. She had developed tuberculosis of the mastoids in 45 and the lungs a year later. In May 1947, she wrote a letter to the editor of the New Yorker asking him to print the following advertisement. Will you save my life? Young nurse ill with tuberculosis for 3.5 years beseeches some kind person to donate $5,000 to $7,000 for streptomycin treatment. Only reward everlasting gratefulness. The ad was never published, but she received $600 from the magazine, and this enabled her to purchase 80 grams of streptomycin. After a month of treatment, she tested negative, recovering from the disease. She was also deaf. I have not found who she was, but know only that she moved to British Columbia. Streptomycin would not come into general use until the early 1950s. If I can just go back a little bit, I want to share something again with you, which I find a delightful understanding of St. Agathe and what it meant and what it has meant to people for well over 100 years. It is a story written again by Elizabeth Wand in her book about the restaurant that she ate at when she was staying in St. Agathe in the very early period. And this is what she described. A gentleman with his wife and little daughter sat next to me at table, and I saw him skimming black peas out of her soup and putting them on the edge of her plate. He said, "Now, dear, eat your soup." But looking at her plate with disgust, she said, "I won't eat my soup, Papa. I don't know which is peas and which is fleas." This brought down the house, and we all laughed long and heartily. Chicken fricassee sounds good, but when the heads are left in, enough said, even if they're beautifully cleaned. When some of the guests spoke to my host about it, he replied, "Good enough for me, good enough for you. You know, like, you go, plenty more come." The independence of the people is something to be admired. It is their country, wrested from the wilds, hewed and made to blossom in their own way. If it doesn't suit you, go away, someone else will come. I had spent the day in the open. The air is like champagne, very heady, and one feels like jumping and running. What an appetite after spending a day outdoors. After supper, I was ready for bed, and even the straw beds and the things that walk or rather run by at night did not prevent me from falling into a dreamless sleep. I thought that was a little thing. Now, I'm arriving at the end of the talk, but before I go further, I wanted to know, did you, Brody, make it on?
Yes, he did. I'm hoping he can open his mic. I think he's on the phone as well. So I will check if I ask him to unmute if he's able to.
Okay, one or the other. Now, just to give you a background, I consulted with Hugh Brody before doing this talk. Hugh Brody is a doctor who worked at the SAN and has some things to share with us. I put Dr. Phelps into the talk for him because he knew Dr. Phelps, and I hadn't put Dr. Phelps in because I didn't have other information for other SANs, but I wanted I wanted so much to hear him. So I have some questions to ask him. And one was, Dr. Phelps began as the doctor there in 1926. And you saw him when? Could you tell us about your first meeting with him?
Hugh, are you able to unmute your phone or your microphone?
Hugh's going to be celebrating, we're going to celebrate with him his 94th birthday in the fall, but he's not that familiar with Zoom. He's got a lot of other very, very interesting subjects to share with us. So we hope we get that mic unmuted.
1 minute, I'll try and call.
Yeah, maybe we can do it by phone. We won't see him, but. I guess it's just hard to figure out how to unmute his mic, eh? I'll leave it silent for a second so that we can get this done, because his information is fascinating.
Joe?
Yeah.
Yeah, just while we're waiting, I wasn't going to pull this in, but if you've, there's also a sort of fascinating account of life in the sands and the tuberculosis business that's in the novel Look Homeward Angel Thomas, I think it's Thomas Hardy, I'm not sure, but it's set in Asheville, North Carolina, which was in that section of North Carolina backing into the Appalachian Mountains. And it was a very similar economy. I mean, this whole thing was a continental phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. There's so much can be written about it. It's fascinating. I mean, we're scratching the surface of it, but there's a lot more to learn. So what's happening here now? I have also things I didn't use. There's so much information about this. Kim Davidman gave me pictures of life in the sand because Kim Davidman is, I imagine you're with us, Kim, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Anyway, Kim gave me these pictures taken of her mother who had tuberculosis and was at the hospital. And she met a Japanese woman whose name was Kim. And she shared these pictures of the hospital and the daily life there, which I didn't put into the talk just because I was concerned about how long it would get. But this subject is fascinating, and it's certainly worth a book. And when that comes out, Kim, I'll be getting back to you for permissions.
Oh, absolutely. Would love to contribute.
Great.
Joe, I'm going to try something. If you ask your questions and Hugh answers on my phone, if you can hear him, because we're not able to unmute him.
Oh, okay. Well,
so Hugh, if you talk now, can you try?
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear me okay? I'm talking now. 1, 2, 3. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear him, but very, very faintly. Can you put it closer to your mic?
And maybe put it louder, that would help.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah. Yeah, we can't hear you well.
Hugh, maybe if you would take off your cell phone, if you hang up on your cell phone and stay on the landline because there's feedback.
Okay.
Oh, I think he took off the wrong phone.
Well, ask him if it's all right with him if I tell him the stories he told me.
Yes, I will. Okay, I'm sure it's fine.
Now, the fascinating thing was that Hugh Brody's, I guess it was his grandfather, came first to one of the first people to come up to a fishing cabin at Lac Brule in 1891. He himself, when he was growing up as a teenager, he had all these little spots all over his body, and everyone in the Laurentians who knew the San, all the Montrealers would just go and see Dr. Phelps when they had a problem. So he went to see Dr. Phelps. And what I found fascinating was when he told me this, he discovered from my information that Dr. Phelps became the medical director the year Hugh was born, 1926. And he diagnosed it as chickenpox and said, I want to show this to some other doctors who came in to look at it. And once they had seen it, Dr. Phelps said to his parents, get him out of here before he makes us all sick. Sometime later, Hugh Brody graduated as a doctor, and he interned at the San working with Dr. Phelps. So you can see what a long life Dr. Phelps had at the hospital. And one of the other interesting things that he shared with me was that in 1952, there was talk about streptomycin, which was not yet in common usage in St. Agathe, and how a lot of people considered it, maybe it's just another one of these dead ends cures that people want that won't really do anything. But of course, it turned out to do a lot. So I wanted to particularly thank Hugh Brody for his help with this project. In the meantime, there's other references, as you can see here, and this will all be more easily seeable on the YouTube video, which will be posted at some point. And I also took the trouble to post Elizabeth Wan's Kississana story on my website, ballyhoo.ca, because I'm just concerned that something like that should be preserved. And it's a really valuable piece of our history. Anyway, this is all thanks to Four Corners. I wanted to thank Chloe and Four Corners, and remind us all that Four Corners is our community center in the Laurentians. It's funded largely by Heritage Canada, but also by donations. And so let's keep it going. Let's support them. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'll just stop the share so that we can see each other and stop the talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe.